Imagine yourself stepping into a hazy honky-tonk on a warm southern night. Neon lights flicker against old posters on the walls, and a smoky smell of whiskey and stale cigarettes mingles with the hum of eager conversation. The band on stage readies their instruments as a figure in a cowboy hat steps forward, guitar in hand, ready to pour his heart out in song. That's the moment. That's the atmosphere where a legend like Hank Williams truly comes alive, where the rawness, the honesty, and the heartbreak in his music resonate through every note. He was a man who packed a lifetime of struggle and triumph into just 29 years, who basically wrote the rule book for modern country music, even as he was self-destructing under the weight of personal demons. Today we're going to dive into the larger-than-life saga of Hank Williams, the so-called Hillbilly Shakespeare, the star behind countless country classics, the man of staggering influence whose tragic personal story is as sorrowful and captivating as the tunes he left behind. Before the fame, Hank was a boy named Hiram King Williams, born into a family that had little more than perseverance and grit to hold them together. In fact, the young Hiram never really got along with his father, who worked at a lumber company. His mother, on the other hand, was a resourceful figure who kept rooming houses to pay the bills. It was a hard-scrabble upbringing from the very start. Money was tight, opportunities were scarce, and so was an environment that might nurture any artistic inclination a young kid had. Perhaps that's why it's so remarkable that Hank, in those earliest days, discovered a spark of something that would eventually change not only his life, but the trajectory of country music forever. But let's not gloss over just how much pain he carried even as a child. Hank suffered from spina bifida, a condition that caused constant discomfort in his spine. For a kid growing up in rural Alabama in the 1920s and 30s, spina bifida was more than a medical diagnosis. It was a stigma. Other children teased him, and he was often sidelined from physical activities most kids took for granted. While most children might be learning to roughhouse and tackle each other in the yard without a second thought, Hank was learning to live with persistent pain that would one day become an unbearable weight. Instead of running around carefree, he spent a lot of time dealing with chronic aches and the emotional burden of feeling different and isolated. That early adversity, though, seemed to forge something powerful in his soul. Maybe the teasing from other kids contributed to his determination to stand out. Maybe the constant pain gave him an intimate understanding of heartbreak and yearning that many people never quite realize until they're older. Even as a child, he showed glimpses of a bold personality. Some recall that he got saddled with peculiar nicknames, Poots, Herky, and Harm, nicknames that, while a bit silly, hint at how distinctive he was in that small community. Certainly these monikers were not particularly dignified, and maybe that was part of the charm. Poots or Herky didn't scream future icon, but if you look closely, these childhood anecdotes reveal a restless energy and an eccentricity that would find its natural outlet in music. Now imagine you're 12 or 13 years old, and music becomes your one possible ticket to a better world. According to some stories, Hank's mother sold peanuts to buy him his first guitar, but others in the hometown insisted they were the ones who paid for it. To be honest, the exact truth might be lost to time. We know for sure that a guitar ended up in Hank's hands, and it changed the course of his life. That unassuming instrument would help him stitch together the deep well of emotion inside him and craft the beginnings of a style that was brand new, yet drew on countless musical traditions in the American South. A pivotal figure in that early development was Rufus T-Tot Payne, an African-American blues musician whose influence on Hank simply can't be overstated. He taught the young musician not just chords and rhythms, but a deeper musical sensibility, an ability to bend notes to convey sorrow, to use melodic phrasing that echoed the heartbreak found in blues, and to essentially fuse country and blues in a way that was groundbreaking for the time. Hank paid Payne in money and food, an arrangement that might sound humble, but it laid the bedrock of Hank's future stardom. The bluesy undercurrent that runs through Hank's country songs can be traced straight back to evenings on front porches and hours spent watching T-Tot Payne play. That sparkle of potential manifested quickly. At age 13, Hank entered a local talent show, belting out WPA blues. He won $15 that day, a pittance in modern terms, but back then it felt like $1 million for a small-town teenager. More importantly, it was a validation of the kernel of confidence growing inside him. He could actually earn money and applause by singing. That had to be a rush like nothing else. Soon after, that same year, he managed to land his first radio appearance. Local stations in the South recognized there was something unique about this wiry, somewhat frail kid with a guitar. That he was so young made it even more extraordinary. If you heard him on the air at 13, you might have been struck by the rawness of his voice, the sincerity in the way he delivered a lyric. It was the beginning of a romance with radio that would eventually lead him to become one of the medium's most beloved and complicated stars. Not long after, at 16, Hank decided school wasn't going to help him get where he needed to go. He dropped out. For some people, that might be the start of a dead-end life, but for Hank, it was his green light to barrel headfirst into music. And oh, did he barrel. He also changed his given name, Hiram King Williams, to something a bit more stage-ready, Hank. It's a short, punchy moniker that, as he put it, sounded more country. And indeed, Hank Williams rolled off the tongue with a rustic twang that suited the music he was creating, which would soon reverberate across the nation. Of course, let's not forget the devastating undercurrent that was spina bifida. With age, the condition only got more agonizing. A failed operation made the pain even more excruciating, leaving Hank reliant on a potent mixture of painkillers and alcohol just to function. At first, maybe it dulled the pain enough for him to get through performances, but addiction is a formidable beast, and it didn't take long for him to tumble deeper into the bottle. The sweet relief of numbness turned into a vicious cycle that shaped the rest of his life. Yet that same life would produce some of the most influential country music the world has ever known. Early in his career, Hank had his share of rejections. He set his sights on the Grand Ole Opry, the pinnacle of country music success, the dream stage for any aspiring country musician. But the Opry initially slammed the door on him. They saw someone with raw talent but also a serious drinking problem, which made him an unpredictable live performer. If you flub a show, or worse, fail to show up at all, you risk damaging the Opry's reputation. Hank simply wasn't ready in their eyes. So for a time, he had to find opportunities elsewhere, playing bars, radio gigs, and smaller shows. There was, however, one bright spot in his personal life that also set the stage for another legendary career. The birth of Hank's son, Randall Hank Williams, with his first wife, Audrey Shepard. This child would later become famous in his own right as Hank Williams Jr. or Bo Cephas, forging a style that leaned toward outlaw country. Hank Sr. may have had a tumultuous personal existence, but passing along that musical heritage would prove to be one of his lasting contributions. Eventually, the Grand Ole Opry couldn't ignore him any longer. His music was making waves regionally, and people were buzzing about the raw authenticity in his voice. When Hank finally stepped on the Opry stage, he became an overnight sensation in that esteemed venue. Audiences erupted in cheers. One performance reportedly ended with 6 encores. 6. It set an Opry record at the time, a testament to the fact that When Hank was on, he was unlike anything country music had seen. There was a vulnerability and a desperate sincerity in his voice that audiences latched onto. His songs felt like they were ripped from the center of a broken heart, and fans couldn't get enough. Not surprisingly, that resonance with audiences produced staggering chart success. Over his short career, 35 of his singles made it to Billboard's top 10 on the country and western charts, with 11 of those singles hitting the coveted #1 spot. This was unheard of back then, cementing Hank as a bona fide superstar. The sheer volume of hits in such a brief period is part of why many call him one of the greatest songwriters in country music history, or for that matter, in American popular music as a whole. If you were to line up Lovesick Blues, Hey Good Lookin', I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, and countless others, you'd have a playlist that stands as a testament to a genius that flared brightly, if tragically briefly. Even with that success, Hank had another side. He harbored a more contemplative, spiritual persona that he feared would clash with his honky-tonk image. So to explore religious and moral themes without muddying the perception of Hank Williams, he recorded gospel-flavored spoken word tracks under the pseudonym Luke the Drifter. Think of it as a sort of alter ego, a creative outlet that let him dive deep into moral parables, spiritual reflection, and songs not exactly in the same vein as his raucous barroom anthems. It's both a fascinating reflection of his multifaceted nature and a clever bit of branding. If fans wanted the rowdy, heartbreak-laden Hank, they could buy his main releases. If they were open to something more pensive and religious, they could hunt down Luke the Drifter records. As his star rose, so did his legendary rowdiness. Stories abounded of Hank using his guitar as a makeshift weapon during bar fights on the road. One cousin recalled that he broke so many guitars on people's heads or in drunken spats that he had to buy a new one almost every week. It adds to the mythic dimension of his persona, a hard-living, hard-drinking country boy who sang about heartbreak and happily reenacted the drama backstage as well. He might have cracked guitars over heads, but he was also cracking open the American music scene to new possibilities. In the thick of his fame, Hank also made his way onto television, making an appearance on the Perry Como Show. For many Americans, seeing Hank alongside Perry Como was their first glimpse of this intriguing new voice they had heard on the radio. He performed Hey Good Lookin', a catchy crowd pleaser that showcased a lighter side of his repertoire. Some might argue that if he had lived longer, he could have paved the way for even more crossovers into the mainstream, or even hopped into film projects like many other musical stars of the era. His brand of magnetism seemed tailor-made for that sort of path, yet the undercurrent of self-sabotage was never far behind. He'd had a steady radio gig in his teenage years, which came to a screeching halt when he started showing up drunk. He was fired, a cautionary tale for how his love affair with the bottle would continue to disrupt opportunities. Even Roy Acuff, himself a legendary figure in country, tried to warn Hank, famously telling him, "You've got $1 million talent, son, but a 10-cent brain." That stung. But as many of us know, external warnings often fall flat against the formidable grip of addiction. Those comedic or light-hearted songs you heard on the radio, they were often overshadowed by the personal turmoil behind the scenes. Hank may have had a stage persona that could be charming, witty, or irreverent. But once the show was over, the spiral into pain, pills, and liquor resumed. It was an era before widespread discussion of addiction as an illness, and the help he needed wasn't easy to come by. In fact, many fans had no clue how badly he was suffering physically and emotionally. Meanwhile, his love life was as tumultuous as his career. He had married Audrey Shepard after meeting her at a medicine show, an odd traveling spectacle that used to roam rural America, hawking elixirs. Their wedding was complicated. It was apparently illegal at first due to a divorce technicality involving Audrey's previous marriage. Nevertheless, Audrey soon became an essential force in managing Hank's career, booking gigs and steering him. She pushed him forward, but the push often came with conflict. The two had fiery personalities that clashed over finances, music, and Hank's uncontrollable drinking. They even fought over her desire to sing duets with him on stage, which Hank resisted at times. It was a rocky partnership that nonetheless yielded a son who would perpetuate the Williams name. During all this, Hank was finally riding high at the Opry. But after a while, the same demon that had caused trouble at local radio stations resurfaced in the biggest venue in country music. He'd miss shows or show up unfit to perform. Eventually, in 1952, the Opry management decided enough was enough and let him go. It was a humiliating blow. Here he was, at the apex of the country world, the man who had once launched 6 encores at the Opry, only to be shown the door. That stung not just professionally, but personally. Being part of the Opry had been a cherished childhood dream. Things at home weren't any better. Hank's marriage to Audrey was in freefall, culminating in a divorce. Seemingly in search of a fresh start, Hank married Billie Jean soon after, but the shadows in his life didn't lift just because he swapped wedding rings. He still carried the same burdens: spina bifida pain, an ever-present bottle, and the emotional fallout from losing his place at the Opry. To add to this swirl of events, he was criticized by some in the country scene for not serving in the military during the World War II or the Korean War. His back condition kept him out, but given the patriotic leanings in many country music circles, that gap in his resume sometimes raised eyebrows. Nonetheless, if we focus on his pure productivity, the numbers are jaw-dropping. Between 1947 and 1952, Hank recorded a staggering 225 songs, 128 of which were his own compositions. Let that sink in. 128 original compositions in roughly 5 years. That's an extraordinary pace, especially for someone dealing with chronic pain, emotional turmoil, and substance abuse. You could argue that writing songs might have been his solace, his therapy, a place where he could channel every ache and heartbreak. He also penned tunes for other artists, though in some cases it took years for fans to realize Hank was the writer behind them. If that's not the hallmark of a musical genius, it's certainly close. Behind closed doors, the battles raged on. Hank and Audrey fought about everything, from money to personal ambition. It's often said he'd come home drunk. They'd scream at each other until the early hours, and then Hank would slump onto a couch or a bed, scrawl lyrics on hotel stationery or napkins, and next morning those scrawled notes might become a heart-stopping new song. The heartbreak he lived by day fueled the heartbreak he immortalized by night. And for every tabloid-like story of a bar brawl or domestic spat, there was an equal story of Hank absolutely mesmerizing a crowd with songs like Lovesick Blues, the track that catapulted him from regional success to a national phenomenon. It's worth noting that Lovesick Blues was actually an older tune, which Hank reworked with his own distinctive style. That's part of what made him special. He could take something pre-existing, breathe new life into it, and make it undeniably Hank. Listeners who heard it on radio stations across America were instantly entranced by that quavering, lonesome quality in his voice. People connected to the heartbreak in a visceral way, as if Hank were some sort of empathic vessel for the universal pain of love lost. He turned heartbreak into a near art form, penning songs that laid raw emotion on the line. Many nights, according to friends, he'd be in a half-drunken stupor, scribbling away, and by morning there'd be a fresh composition that would break your heart and yet draw you right in. The emotional roller coaster he was riding fed directly into the music. Each heartbreak lyric was more than just a cliche about lost love. It was rooted in actual sorrow, actual longing. That authenticity radiated from his recording and made them instant classics. Curiously enough, Hank was also vocal about politics, at least to some extent. He supported Dwight D. Eisenhower for president and even sent him a birthday telegram. Sadly, Hank passed away just before Eisenhower took office in 1953, so he never got to see the general become commander-in-chief. It's a tiny detail, but it underscores the broader story. Hank was a man who engaged with the world, not just shut himself away. He had opinions, ambitions, and interests outside of music, even if his personal challenges often overshadowed them. There's also a recurring note that Hank was a savvy mind when it came to the music business. He understood what radio wanted, he knew what made crowds go wild, and he had a keen sense of how to market himself as a genuine country boy in a rapidly modernizing America. Some say that if he'd had a better handle on his substance abuse, he might have transcended music entirely and become a major cultural icon akin to Elvis Presley, who, by the way, was himself significantly influenced by Hank. It's not hard to imagine Hank dabbling in acting or broadening his brand in other ways if fate had allowed him more time. In truth, he did leave behind a handful of cameo-like appearances in short performance reels or newsreels, but never had the chance to star in a Hollywood film. It's intriguing to consider how the Hillbilly Shakespeare might have fared in the glitz of Tinseltown. Then again, perhaps the heartbreak of his personal life would have followed him to any city, any stage, any opportunity. In his last days, Hank was traveling with a so-called doctor, a man who turned out not to be a legitimate medical professional. This individual provided him with a dangerous mix of prescriptions, presumably to help Hank manage his pain and addiction. It was a lethal cocktail, especially when combined with alcohol. On January 1st, 1953, while en route to a show in Canton, Ohio, Hank was found unresponsive in the back seat of his Cadillac. The cause of death was officially heart failure, but we now know it was likely spurred by the tragic mix of pills, booze, and underlying health issues. He was just 29 years old. In the wake of his passing, more family drama emerged. Hank had fathered a daughter, Jet Williams, who was born just a few days after he died. For years, Jet didn't realize who her father was. It wasn't until she was an adult that she discovered her lineage and found herself part of the complicated Williams legacy. Then there were the legal battles. Audrey, his ex-wife, sued MGM Records and Acuff Rose for a share of Hank's future royalties. The courts eventually ruled in her favor. If that weren't enough, newly discovered lyrics surfaced decades later in a Sony dumpster, lost pages from Hank's creative wellspring. These lyrics, rescued and eventually turned into the lost notebooks of Hank Williams, were recorded by various esteemed artists such as Bob Dylan and released in 2011, giving fans a haunting glimpse into what might have been had Hank lived longer. It's hard to overstate the breadth of Hank's influence. Dolly Parton, Elvis Presley, Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash. These are just a few iconic names who've cited Hank Williams as a key inspiration. The lines he wrote, the sorrow he carried, the melodies he popularized, they flowed into American culture and continue to echo through modern music. Some of his songs have been covered so many times, they've become part of the bedrock of country, rock, and even jazz in certain renditions. People have tried to bottle the secret sauce that made his music so universal, but it's elusive. Perhaps it's the unfiltered honesty, the willingness to express deep loneliness or yearning for redemption in a plain-spoken language that cuts straight to the heart. Posthumous honors poured in. In 2010, over half a century after his death, Hank was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his contributions to music. Many considered this a long overdue recognition, given how profoundly he'd shaped the American musical landscape. That a man who left us so young could receive such a prestigious accolade decades later only underscores the depth of his legacy. It speaks to the timelessness of his work and the continuing hold it has on listeners. Let's not forget the day of his funeral, which stands as a testament to how beloved he was, even amid the controversies and failings. Thousands of fans lined the streets, some of them openly weeping, forming a funeral procession for the ages. It was as if the entire region, if not the entire country, paused to mourn the silencing of a singular voice. You can almost imagine the hush that fell over those gathered, their tears punctuating the still air, while a lone fiddle or a steel guitar might have drifted through the crowd as a final tribute. And so here we are, recounting the life of Hank Williams, a man who rose from poverty and chronic pain to become one of country music's brightest stars, only to see his life cut short by the same spiraling addictions that had haunted him for years. But to simply call his story tragic would be reductive. Yes, it's tragic that someone with such a gift and so much potential left this earth before his 30th birthday. Yet his music, filled with both the triumphant highs of heartbreak anthems and the soulful lows of battered self-reflection, continues to resonate across generations. He laid the foundation for the rockabilly explosion, influenced the folk revival, shaped the course of country, and even brushed against early hints of rock and roll. You can't measure Hank's importance just by record sales or chart numbers, though those are impressive. You have to look at the artists who followed in his wake and the entire direction of American music, which pivoted in no small part because of him.